Most people think their greatest asset is the smartest person in the room. Jon Berghoff has spent decades proving people wrong. He's facilitated collective intelligence with companies like Google, BMW, and NASA. And what he has shown is that the magic lies not in any one person, but in the spaces between them. In our conversation today, we cover being, doing, oxytocin, dopamine, and perhaps the greatest piece, what's going on inside us.
Your nervous system sets the tone. Your energy speaks before you do. How you show up is the culture. I'm Dr. Tamsin and this is Hot Habits, Conscious Leadership in Action. Today, we're joined by Jon Berghoff, founder of Exchange and one of the world's leading facilitators of transformational gatherings. He's worked with organizations like NASA, Google, BMW, Facebook, and Stanford, and has trained more than 26,000 change agents around the world, including me, in the art of conscious convening. One of the things I really appreciate about Jon is how he is so honest about practicing conscious leadership in his own life, including working and living with Adair Cates, who's also been a guest here on Hot Habits. He's also incredibly transparent about how he builds his business and creates opportunities, which is really helpful for people like me who are trying to do meaningful work in this world while figuring it all out as we go. Welcome, Jon. Thank you.
Dr. Tamsin, I'm so happy to see you. I was thinking this morning, I can hardly put to words. It's makes me really happy to be with you.
It's really fun. Thank you. Thank you. So at the start of every Hot Habits conversation, I ask my guests to bring an object with them, something that represents a hot habit in their lives. I think of it as a way of bringing leadership out of theory and into everyday reality. So what did you bring with you today and why did you choose it?
Okay. So I've grabbed and I'm holding up this, what do you call this? I mean, it's a plant, but there's a name for when you take the leaves and you put it in the whatever. So I grabbed this little plant, and the reason why is because when you say hot habits and, whatever habits I have for my own attempts to live more consciously, nature plays a big role in guiding me. And, it sounds interesting to some. It sounds like theory, but nature is about whatever gives life, and so it's a reminder to me. I try and spend time in nature every day. That all of the practices that I practice and habits and things that I do, and I fall off and I get back on, and even my business strategy. I mean, so many things I find when I lose my way, I just have to ask, okay, let's get back to what gives life to me. And that might remind me, okay, I just got to breathe or be here with whatever I'm being with or who. And it follows me all the way into, decisions as an entrepreneur. But I chose that plant because nature is a guide to me.
So it sounds to me your habit it's really about support, and it's about you articulating something that when you are in alignment with it, when you are acknowledging it, when you are not blocking it out, when you're committing to that being a part of your life, it affects not only you, but obviously the way you show up as a leader and the way you develop your business, the way you show up as a parent, as a partner, and everything else in your life. It sounds to me like it's a sort of energetic connection. Is that right?
Yeah, that's fair. Fair. Yeah.
One of the things that I'm really curious about, given your history of, leading and convening and facilitating, is that I feel like as a sort of relative newbie in this space, that a lot of leaders still have this belief, maybe you could call it a fallacy or a sort of a misunderstanding, that their job is to have answers and to be about driving outcome, income, KPIs. It's all about sort of control and answers and being the person at the top of the hierarchy, for want of a better sort of visual. So in your experience of facilitating thousands of groups and people, what happens when a leader goes, you know what, I'm going to let go of being the smartest person in the room, and I'm going to trust the intelligence in this group?
what happens is everything that matters becomes possible, but it's easier to say than it is to do. And I'm smiling because it's Friday and I'm talking to you, but also because I laugh a little. I agree with what you're saying that there are many who may still believe that to lead or to manage or to provide value as a consultant, whatever, is about knowing things and being able to control things. And I don't know if anyone's been paying attention the last, 4, 5, 7, 10 years. This is a really tough time for people that want to control things. And it's a really tough time for people who want to think they're supposed to know everything, So your question, though, is what happens when a leader, and I'm paraphrasing, is maybe willing to let go of the need or the thought that they have to have the answers, and they're willing to shift some of their energy towards, well, what happens if I give some of that energy to the questions that we invite others into? And, I joked playfully, but in all sincerity, when we are willing to not just have to be the one with the answers, but to also, it's a new identity to be a guide that invites perspective, intelligence, wisdom of others. And it needs different approaches and different tools. But what it makes possible, which what I heard in your question, is it enables us to bring people alive, and maybe in ways and in situations where it's really helpful. It enables us to create conditions where people are invited to think, to contemplate, to learn from each other. And when it's done really well, we're not just scaling up, as we say, because we're all about what happens in group environments, as you said. We're not just scaling up curiosity, but everything that leads to. It's like, oh, now we're listening to each other. What does that lead to? The dissolving of the ego, the best of humanness comes alive when a leader, instead of trying to control or tell or talk to people, is willing to ask, invite them to connect to each other's wisdom. So many meaningful things become possible. That's what comes up for me.
One of the things that you said that I want to dig into a little bit more is the kind of the curiosity, listening, and letting go of ego. Because I think, there's something that's brave about that. You have to kind of be willing to let go of control, which if you are somebody in a position of quote unquote power, which is you sort of alluded to in the world at large, that's a terrifying thing to sort of soften and either say, I don't know, or I'm willing to, engage other views, ideas, concepts around that. So, if we dig into that a little bit more, is there a question or a couple of questions that you have found to be really helpful to trigger that shift in ego control curiosity for people who are kind of holding on to this idea that they have to be the person in control?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's good news. There's kind of a consolation prize. And I do really believe, as one of my mentors, Dr. Ron Fry, said at one of our trainings that he was a guest at years ago, when I said, Ron, what are you learning about our world right now? And this was maybe right as we were all kind of coming out of COVID, I think. And he said, Jon, I'm pretty convinced that control is entirely an illusion. However, the amount of influence that we have is often beyond what we comprehend. And so the interesting thing is, it's not about giving up control to the extent that I, as a manager or a leader, have no role here. It's really about understanding an entirely different way to be far more influential through how we lead, how we engage, and in the case of what you're asking, through the types of questions we ask. So you ask for examples. Well, it always is dependent on the circumstance or the situation, but I could give a couple examples. So I'll just pull from, a few different environments. So not too long ago, Hewlett-Packard invited us to lead their top 500 leaders that came together for their annual leadership conference, which was a tremendous honor. And the reason they brought our methodology in is because you got 500 people from 50 countries who are really dang smart. And yes, they had many of their senior executives go up on the stage and give updates and talk about what's going on. But then all throughout, they wanted to tap the wisdom in the room. So I'll give you one example. Like one of the themes and the mantras, a drum that they were beating was around organizational execution, which, there's a whole meaning to them around that phrase. So one example of a question that that I brought into that room was, so instead of the old model, which would be, well, let's just have a few people stand here and tell all these people what organizational excellence looks like. But that completely dismisses how much wisdom is sitting in the room. So they brought us in over 2.5 days. We did a series of these conversations. And in this case, I handed the room the question, when and where have you seen organizational excellence at its best? And we're not going to talk theoretically. I want us to get in small groups and share real examples with each other. And then study your examples. And at the end of the experience, we even had them kind of nominate or crowdsource or vote up. And we pulled stories into the room of how they had dealt with incredible challenges to overcome to serve a customer issue, or ways they came together as an organization to help employees that needed to tackle some creative problem. Needless to say, when you design a question like that and you hand it to a room like that, and you're willing to give the space for people to bring their experience in, you're not just honoring what all the research says about collective intelligence, you're learning a shit ton that is really hard to encapsulate by having one or two people go up and lecture everybody about organization or execution excellence, whatever the topic was. So that's one example. I could give others, but let me see what that brings up.
Yeah, I think, as you were talking, what was occurring to me is, how there seems to be almost a break in the fact that, evolutionarily, we're designed to learn by story, right? Before we had the written word, it was all, orators, right? It was about the story and what the story gave in terms of morals or ethics or love or the environment or whatever it was, right? And, one of the things we so often see with the kind of, sage on the stage model idea of being a leader is either they're stuck in a story that's very limited to their personal experience, or it's data, which, unless you are a total data nerd, it doesn't create that emotional connection. And so what you're really describing to me and what it feels like is that you are helping people find their own stories. And by sharing their stories, people hear glimpses of, oh, I resonate with that. I connect with that. And that then brings on a greater sense of transformation.
I love that you chose to double click on the story aspect. I'll share an interesting example with you. Actually, later today, I'm meeting with a good friend of mine, Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who's a pretty well-known author in like the entrepreneurial space. And he recently published a book called The Science of Scaling. And I've known Ben for many years, and we have an appreciation for each other's work. And he and his co-author, Blake Erickson, and their team, when they put this book out last year, they called us and said, we want you to lead our member events. So we led one last fall, and we're leading another one coming up in a few months. We're meeting with their team today, and we're actually talking through the design of this member event. There'll be several hundred entrepreneurs who've studied their work. So there is a role of the framework, the frameworks, the teachings, the insight. There's a role that's played. And when we get to this conference, one of the activities we're looking at doing is having everybody in the room sharing a story to reveal the most important lesson they've learned thus far about scaling their businesses. And something you're pointing out one of the reasons why that type of conversation and that approach in that setting is so valuable is because we are honoring the theory and the frameworks that informed those customers. But now what we're doing is we're learning from experiences, not by talking theoretically, but by being grounded in reality. And you said something interesting about trust and data. We're living at a time right now where trust in everything and everybody's at an all-time low. And anybody can create whatever data they want. And because of that, nobody believes a lot of things, for right or wrong. But there's one type of data that people always agree with, and it's their own. And when you invite a room eye to eye to hear each other's examples and stories, that you know this is their true lived experience, the trust in learning from my and your story is very different than somebody else presenting some information, and we just don't know if it's grounded in reality. So you're picking up on something, and if I could say one more thing, I just gave an example where, we're using our method at a conference of sorts, but go back into a team, an organization. Somebody taught me years ago that there's no such thing as, there is not one story. When you have 25 people on a team, there is the whole story, which is what you discover when you realize everybody has their own story. And when you create experiences where you can bring all those stories into the room, you've seen us do this, our annual in-person conference, where you were recognized last year amongst our whole global community. That conference, we open it up, not by me, the founder, or anybody telling everybody why we're in the room, which there's an answer and that's a story, but we actually invite our members to explore together and to actually co-create an answer together to why are we in this room. That's an example of surfacing the whole story, which is contributed to by every voice in that room. And anybody listening to this, if you can follow this example I'm giving, the power of inviting a group of people to contribute to conversations like that, it's hard to overstate.
Yeah, no, and I think the other thing that's really interesting about it too, and it's making me think of this sort of original definition of a mastermind, right? Which is that when you create a space for people who are, open, aligned, connective, curious, generous, expansive, fill in the positive word, right? You build an intelligence, you build a mind that is greater than the individual. And that, to me, in this world of, polarization, I've lived in the US for nearly a quarter of a century, and watching the polarization and the kind of people getting to the ends of the continuum, right? Rather than being able to have the conversation. That's the thing that I think is so powerful. And one of the things that I think has been a big driver for me to really continue to learn and study in this space of how to facilitate and be curious and particularly lean into appreciative inquiry. So for those of you listening who are not familiar, appreciative inquiry is a model which is about looking for what is working in a system, in a relationship, in a model, right? Which goes against our natural brains, our natural sort of neuroscientific way of moving through the world is, how can I keep myself safe? What's broken? What's not working? Where are the woolly mammoths, right? And so for me, talking about this idea you have of following the breadcrumbs, right? Which is, to me, my PhD was quantitative data analysis. My postdoctoral fellowship was qualitative data analysis, analyzing conversations. And it was a real shift in the way I thought about data gathering, because with quantitative, it's what's the reaction time? How is the pupil dilating? What are the electrical activity in the brain, right? It's sort of concrete, clear, numeric. Whereas analyzing conversations and looking for patterns is much more, as you say, about following the breadcrumbs and kind of what are people talking about? What is the theme here? What is emerging? And I think this idea of following the breadcrumbs in this world that we're inhabiting is a really powerful but brave way of doing it, right? Because you are really working hard not to impose your natural, the way you grew up, your gender, where you live in the world, all of these things that contribute to what I'm seeing means this, right? Confirmation bias, right? All of that kind of stuff. As you do more of this work, like what are the breadcrumbs that you are following? You can go with this personally or professionally, Jon. That maybe signal the way that things are changing and giving away to new things.
Well, I'd like to share. I'm in love with the question that you're asking. I want to make love to the question you're asking right now, in the presence of whoever's watching this. So I'm one of those people, years ago I was told I had problems, and I'm sure I did, and I know I still do. And over time, those problems, I've slowly figured out how to turn them into superpowers. And one of them is that my brain, is constantly wanting to figure shit out, which can be helpful unless it's 3 a.m. and I need to fucking go back to sleep, right? So I'm very fortunate and I'm privileged in that my brain has led me to places and people that have been incredible breadcrumbs for me. And I see how I've benefited because I was smart enough to not be dumb enough that I'd listened to these people. And I'll give you 2 places where the breadcrumbs sit for me. One is in some of the most cutting edge research and scientific perspectives. But then the other comes from stories, prophecies that were told thousands of years ago. And I'll start with the kind of scientific perspective. So there's a story that you've heard me tell, I know this, that was first presented to me by a gentleman named Eric Teller over at Google. And it's a way of understanding our world. To me, this was a breadcrumb 8 years ago that I tell this story a couple times a month still. And it was a way of understanding this moment in time. And there's a picture that goes with it. And the picture and the story are essentially saying that we may now live at a time in history where the rate at which our world, and especially technology, the rate at which these things are changing, and you could call this a hypothesis, a theory. I've presented this picture to 28,000 people live in the last 5 years. Most people say this is my reality. The rate at which our world is changing has maybe surpassed the rate at which we as humans are equipped to adapt to this change, right? And actually, I know you and I can see each other if someone may be listening to this. I'm going to overlay what I just said with a report that came out last week. Maybe many of your listeners are familiar with this report. Anthropic, I think they're the creator of Claude, one of these AI.
They are, and actually my brother is the head of international business development.
Okay. Well, maybe he created this chart. So I have this sitting in front of me. And what this is, if somebody can't see it, I'll just describe this. It's a way of looking at every professional occupation and the extent to which the red represents AI is already doing these things, and the blue represents the projection of how much of these professions AI is going to do. And if someone's looking, they're either depressed or demoralized or dysregulated if they're looking at the chart. And if they're listening, they're wanting to see the chart to see how fearful they should be. But it's not a new story. Tamsin, you asked breadcrumbs, right? I think when we look at that, we have to understand that as scary as it is, and maybe it ought to be, there's a group of us that are gonna find the presence to ask, well, who do I need to be? And what should I do about it, right? Because if you look at the chart, there's actually a little bit of space to the right of the blue. So what will it mean to live over there? And if you sit with that question for just a little bit, you realize what it's going to mean. Everything we know is being substituted, replaced. What it's going to mean is those of us who are able to support our fellow travelers to deal with complexity, those of us who are able to support our fellow travelers who you think people are stressed out and dysregulated today, it's nothing. It's only going to increase. So, you do incredible work, not only with habits, but teaching people how to cultivate the capacity to be present under pressure. Like, people who work in those domains, you're not going to be just fine. You're going to be who everybody's running towards. And of course I'm biased, so everything I'm saying is, everyone should test it against their own gut. But the extent to which this chart is true, and a lot of people feel like they're witnessing it happen, then it means more and more and more the challenges that we're all dealing with, it is more and more true that none of us as individuals have the answers. And the more we're going to need to figure out how to discover and create solutions together. And who's going to facilitate us being able to work together? Because what is also happening, a breadcrumb, is for right or for wrong, so many of these amazing technological advancements are, they're organized and optimized for our attention, or as some point out, dopamine. And we don't want to beat up dopamine. Dopamine's not a bad thing, but anything played so much that eventually becomes a weakness is a breadcrumb. And I think anything that becomes increasingly rare, like for example, right now, and you know this, the Surgeon General of the United States a few years ago said, what's killing more people than cigarettes is loneliness right now. The degree to which people are feeling human connection is measurably going down. The trust that we all have, the Edelman Trust Barometer, this has been measured for 2 decades, all-time low. The rise of AI and how that's infusing everything we see in the digital sphere, our trust is only going to continue to plummet. So here's the irony of this is a breadcrumb, is while our world seems to be optimized for dopamine, those of us who are building skills that actually connect people and help people to reestablish trust, which means optimized for oxytocin, are gonna be well positioned. So I'm seeing it myself. I have companies that are calling us right now saying, Jon, we're bringing 300 leaders together, right? And we can't put another slide up. And we can't give them another, we need them to turn to each other. Because all the conflict and tension in our world trickles into our organizations and our communities. And the Dalai Lama said it, that the cause of conflict is just we forget about the relationships with each other. So I think if you look at these modern trends, any of us who are in the business of helping humans to deal with pressure or to connect with and deal with complexity with each other are very well positioned. And I also just want to offer a perspective that I learned from 2 teachers of mine, 2 amazing women who, interestingly, they both may be today somewhere around the age of 80 years old. And which is notable because as you and I are talking, our countries are in the middle of blowing each other up right now and we're all fucked. And it's just an expression of when masculinity goes wrong, because wounded masculine, the answer is always war. And maybe we're going to have to blow ourselves up before we eventually rebalance. But I do think we need this wise feminine wisdom for a moment when the wounded masculine seems to be continuously out of control. And so 2 teachers of mine both introduced me to several different prophecies. One was introduced by Meg Wheatley. So this is not a modern breadcrumb. This is a breadcrumb that this is the Tibetan prophecy of the Shambhala warrior was laid down for us 800 to 1,000, or no, about 1,000 years ago. And they said there will be a time of extraordinary destruction where technology and weapons and war and what we do to our planet is going to be devastating. And when that time comes, there will be a group of warriors that arise, but in these warriors will find their way into power centers, but you won't recognize them by uniforms they wear. And their weapons are not weapons of violence and destruction. Their weapons are compassion and insight. And what's interesting is Meg Wheatley taught me that all throughout history, which does repeat itself with pinpoint accuracy, in the last 20 times our civilization collapsed with pinpoint accuracy, there have always been, when systems collapse, people who arise. And so this is a crumb that was laid thousands of years ago, or in this type of prophecy. And it may or may not be true, but I find it to be useful.
Yeah, and right, and I think so. There's two things that that jump out of that. One is, I've been a Buddhist for about 16 years, for 15 years, and one of the things that I've always appreciated about Buddhism in comparison to a lot of other sort of quote unquote religions is this don't believe anything I say, go out and figure it out for yourself, right? It's this, I'm going to give you some ideas, but you need to see whether this is real in your own personal experience. And this sort of shift to, one of the themes of what you were saying, which I think is really interesting, with the wounded masculine and the dopamine, oxytocin kind of almost battle, right? Is this idea of shifting away from the doing and more to the being, right? And you could say that's also from like action to feeling, from masculine to feminine, from sun to moon, right? There's lots of other sort of polarities that we could use to reflect on that. But, one of the things that, the more I do this work and the more I see what's going on in the world, the more I feel like it's almost a moral or ethical stance that I am kind of putting my stake in the ground of that as leaders, in the space of conscious leadership, right? Conscious, aware leadership impact is that if we are not doing the inner work, if we're not doing this regulation, we are like ethically, off task, right? It's my moral, ethical duty as somebody who wants to do good in this world to do this energetic inner leadership so that when I get into the collective, I can be curious. I can let go of my ego. I can step from doing to feeling. I can let go of the dopamine of being like, oh, you're wonderful, and be sitting and basking in the praise of being told that my ideas are amazing, right? And so that for me feels like a really sort of juicy place, yes, the world feels like it's burning, but stepping into that energy feels juicy and exciting, right? To lean into.
It's a calling. And for many, it is connected to a deeper, in many cases, spiritual perspective. And it's an invitation to really ask, what does it mean to serve right now? And for many of us, it could be an important reminder, because there is a kind of an arrogance and an ignorance, and Meg refers to this as the drug of hopium. For any of us to think that there is some sort of mass rising of consciousness right now, that we are on the way up, I'm not so sure. Do you want the current data, or do you want the 25 times over the last 10,000 years that this has all repeated itself? Or do you want to just walk outside, And I think in times like this, we want to ask, what can I do where I am with who I can serve? Because to think that we can actually reverse or turn around things that are happening systemically, it's ignorant to how these systems really work. And this is why I really love this phrase that the opportunity now is to be an island of sanity in a sea of chaos. And for some of us, I like how you say it, it is a moral imperative. And it's also why I'm a big proponent of, for those of us who are working in the entrepreneurial institutions of business, that to stop and realize like we have a really important role to play. And I mean, look at what the institutions of government or religion, or even the challenges we're facing in education, there's a lot of problems in all these institutions. And I actually think entrepreneurs and the institution of business needs to become one of the most important forces for good, because we have a capacity to do that. It's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of the philosophy and the organization, conscious capitalism. And it's just so notable that one of the founding members of that organization, Raj Sisodia, and a colleague of his, Dr. Nalima Bhatt, the book that they just released, which is one of my favorites of all the books that both of them have released, is titled Healing Leaders. And that book is about everything you just acknowledged. It's about a journey to recovering who we really can be and who we really are. How do we know ourselves so that we can love ourselves, so that we can be ourselves, so that we can express ourselves and complete ourselves and heal ourselves? I think it's notable that Raj, who has shaped the whole Business for Good movement over the past 2 decades, is coming forward saying we right now have to lean so far into resolving our own deepest inner wounds as leaders, which is very much what I hear you referencing.
Yes, and I think we could spend another hour talking about this, but I'm going to work on wrapping us up so that we don't go down another whole fascinating rabbit hole. I think, thinking about what we've covered today, I think one of the things that really stayed with me and the image that it produces is this idea of the neural network, right? Which is that we're not alone, right? That this idea of the collective intelligence, reciprocal causality, the part affects the system affects the parts. This idea when we do the work on ourselves, we affect others. How I'm being affects how I'm doing affects my being, right? The dance between oxytocin and dopamine. So all the way through this, I'm feeling this energy that you really embody in how you live personally, how you lead and move through the world, and what you're kind of building is this idea of, connectedness from a sense of, from a place of like grounded, positive, like the island of sanity in the sea of chaos. If our listeners just take one thing from this conversation based on all of the fun places we've been, one insight, one shift, or maybe even one action or a question to ask themselves, what would you want that to be, Jon?
So since we're coming to a wrap here, I want to end where I started. So I've got my little plant in front of me here. So everything in nature grows towards the sun. It's called the heliotropic effect. We move towards that which gives life. There's another interesting dynamic in nature, in that in nature there is something that is present always, and that is cycles of giving and receiving. Nutrients, sunshine, information, energy. And so I want to take your question and let Mother Nature give the answer, which is, if there's one practical takeaway that I'm extending, it's for all of us in our next interaction, in our our next moment of solitude, because this is something I could take to another person, but I could also give it to myself. What might it look like, sound like, or feel like to create a cycle of giving and receiving?
Oh, that's so juicy. And I want to get my journal out and start reflecting. Thank you so much, Jon, for joining me today on Hot Habits with Dr. Tamsin. I really, really appreciate your time and insight and mentorship.
Dr. Tamsin, you're an inspiration to me, and it's an honor that I got to be here.
Thanks for being here, and thank you for taking the time to listen. Until next time, remember that the way you lead your inner world shapes how you lead on the outside. I'm Dr. Tamsin Astor. Thanks for listening to Hot Habits.